Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you joining in from different time zones. Really thank you all for joining this webinar today. We have a special topic planned out for you, specifically the shift left API security. And James, time short as fly. This is our second webinar. We had one earlier on deep dive on API linting. So without further ado, I'll leave the floor open to you, James, to introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Adib. My name is James Higginbotham. I'm the founder of LaunchAny. We're a consulting firm that helps organizations establish, grow, and mature their API programs. So a lot of what we do is help with training, coaching, establishing an API governance program inside of organizations that are in their digital transformation journey. We stay pretty busy doing a lot of those types of tasks.
Thanks, James. Yeah. And just a bit introduction on myself as well, for those of you joining in who are not familiar with me. My name is Adib, and I started out my tech journey as a Java developer. I was in the banking domain for about 3 years and then joined APIwiz. Started out as a platform engineer, and now I handle pre-sales here at APIwiz. Now that that's out of the way, I think we have an exciting topic planned out for today, the shift left API security. In fact, well, one of the most pressing challenges in today's API ecosystem today is with respect to API security and API lifecycle management, and a lot of the challenges associated with that. So I think, James, a perfect starting point of our conversation would be, what are some of the most common API security challenges that you see organizations are struggling with today?
Sure. Yeah, that's it's really a big concern. A lot of organizations have a lot of security concerns. They're seeing a lot of articles in various news outlets about malicious activity and APIs being the point of security, malicious attacks and different types of attack vectors from APIs. And so a lot of the challenges stem around how do we make sure that our APIs are deployed consistently in a secure manner? Have we put all the right processes in place? And a lot of that stems from organizations that are moving very quickly. We have a very fast moving pace now with everything that's going on, both with a combination of how the economy is shifting, opportunities are being created by new innovations in technology. It's making it much easier to deliver APIs. And part of that is to keep in mind is that a lot of APIs are used to power front ends and mobile applications. So even if you don't have a formal API program per se, or you're not designing an API platform as part of your organization where you can leverage it across different parts of the organization and with your partners and such, APIs are still being produced to power a lot of these new digital channels. And so what ends up happening is we have APIs that are deployed, but perhaps because of limited time or incomplete processes, we see opportunities for malicious activity using the API surface area as a point of attack. And so even for those organizations that do have some processes in place and do have an API gateway, there are a lot of challenges around how do we automate this? How do we ensure that every API we deploy is protected? And how do we prevent shadow APIs from creeping in and getting around some of those processes? So that's a lot of what we see in organizations today when it comes to API security challenges.
Yeah, absolutely agree, James. In fact, just to take an example, just a day ago, APIwiz had released our Q2 updates for 2023. And one of the interesting statistics in that was just over 87% of our conversations from prospects across the APAC region, the Middle East and Africa, and a lot of the conversations that I've personally seen is they're citing reasons saying that there are a lot of challenges with the API security, especially they're more interested in the API governance and security aspects of the API lifecycle. That aligns well with our topic of discussion today as well. And even an interesting note on the topic that you mentioned in terms of insufficient governance and a lack of a formalized process. So James, my next question to you would be, how would this API governance sit in the grand scheme of things, and how would it solve for this lack of a formalized process?
Well, a lot of times when a lot of organizations hear the term API governance, those that have been around for a while probably think about SOA governance, service-oriented architecture governance, and how heavyweight that was. We had lots of processes and checks, and everything was manual. And usually there was one team central in the organization that approved every service that went out the door. At least a lot of the organizations I consulted to in the 2000s and early 2010s, that's what we saw. But over time, what we realized was that API governance can be lighter weight and it can be automated. So you do need some formal processes to check to see if your APIs are configured properly. We have an API lifecycle that oftentimes starts with discovery and leads into a design and then a delivery and then a deployment, and then we monitor and manage those APIs. And we do that over and over again iteratively as we listen, gain feedback, make adjustments, add new features, and so on to our APIs. So as we do that and deploy our APIs, which is not a one-time thing, we need to have checks throughout the API lifecycle that verify if our APIs have been applied, have had the right security policies applied, if we're implementing the right guidelines that we have for the API governance of our particular industry, whether we have regulatory requirements we have to check for, if it's just standard preventative measures to prevent our APIs from being one more vulnerability that can allow data breaches, unauthorized access to our systems. And we can do this automated or manual, and I've seen both in a lot of organizations, but those that have benefited from it the most use an automated procedure using different assets along the way. And one of the things they use is an open API specification. They use that to drive a lot of the policy declarations for their APIs. So we see open API specification oftentimes used to capture the design of an API, the contract, and then generate documentation from it, and maybe even generate a little bit of boilerplate code from it, or generate a client library from it, or something like that. But now people are using it to incorporate into their API design lifecycle, and they're using it to drive a lot of governance. And so we see a lot of application of automation centered around the open API specification. And that allows us to have an API governance program or set of standards and guidelines without requiring some small team to review every API that comes through the pipeline, by at least automating the most critical aspects of our API lifecycle, including the deployment procedures and so on, to make sure that all those policies are correctly applied.
Yeah, absolutely, James. In fact, I feel that now is a good point to shift over to a short demo that I've prepared to just briefly demonstrate the topic about design time governance at the design stage here. So what I will do is quickly present the APIwiz platform as well. So just to take some of James's point that he mentioned earlier, when it comes to shifting left in API security, we're not talking about security just at one phase of the life cycle, such as you have a lot of tools that are focused on the runtime today, just by updating or patching a policy at runtime, but that acts more like a filter and a sort of damage control approach. But when you talk about API security as a whole, it has to be viewed from process perspective, which means that when you want to shift left earlier on in the life cycle, right from your defining and designing your APIs, for example, in this particular case, I have my central schema registry. It could involve defining your data models that are going to consistently reference across your APIs and uniquely manage all your revision management for your data models, maintain active and deprecated states for all your data models so that they can consistently be referenced across your APIs. And these all contribute towards the overall security and governance of your APIs. Even when it comes to API design, you'd see that we can start controlling all the different stages of the API design, right from creating it in draft stage, updating it. Where's my API design? Is it currently under review, or has it been retired? Are there any changes required for this API? And more often that's overlooked is you want to scope limit those APIs, meaning you want to clearly define a boundary saying that these are the set of teams that are going to have access and visibility into modifying and making edits on this API, so that this API consistently gets referenced across only these teams. So that's another aspect of when it comes to API security. Not to mention the API linting aspect. So one of the ways that you can automate the design time governance, particularly on APIwiz, is to make use of our APIwiz linter, which means that not just for your data models, but even for your open API designs, as soon as you make changes across those data models in design, every single event is going to trigger an automated design time lint that gets run. And you can see here that every single event has triggered an API lint. It could be, you can configure a linting rule that's as simple as checking the case of an operation ID, whether it follows your organizational convention of a kebab case, for example. Over here, it's following a non-kebab case, which means that it needs to be lowercase with hyphenated. So that's why it's been tagged as a error over here. But even when it comes to configuring your rule sets, you can say that, hey, I want to configure a rule set for a particular subset of an API. So those are also some things that you can configure on the APIwiz linting dashboard. In fact, some of the other challenges that I also see that enterprises face today are, there are a lot of CLI-based linting tools available out there, but one of the challenges there are enterprises are hesitant in order to sort of learn a particular coding style or a syntax in order to pass those files onto the CLI-based linting tool. So APIwiz linting solves that by having a completely GUI-based approach, and you can start configuring all your rule sets. And just to take an example of, let's say I want to run a particular rule set against an API, I can start selecting my API and a specific revision of that API and start running the test. And the results, once triggered, would be available on the main home screen dashboard. So you can see here that I already have my report available. And of course, my operation ID is not following camel case because I do have a hyphen over here. But just to extend this example, it could just as easily be extended to those use cases where you want to validate something like a mandatory authorization header, or even a case convention, or whether your API follows the HTTPS protocol. So these are all short examples of how you can employ the API linting to automate your design time governance. And just to relate it back to the data dictionary and design, you'd have the same linting side panel that's available for you to immediately start relating these API linting concepts as well. And that's how we're handling the API linting on APIwiz during the design time phase.
Very nice. Yeah, I've seen a lot of organizations starting to do a lot of automation in this way, but one of the challenges that they're having, and you rightly pointed it out, is having to have some way for them to use it from the command line. There are some plugins for some code editors, but it's not enforcing it because it's completely disconnected from the rest of their pipeline. A developer may or may not have that plugin installed. So it becomes a lot more difficult, and you know, sometimes the messages aren't as clear, or there's not directly a tie back between the error message and the line where the problem was found. So they're trying to kind of navigate that. And while we're seeing some innovations in some different areas, this is actually quite powerful because we're designing and getting instant feedback, and so the team can know that if there's some linting rules that are, as you said, are looking for certain headers, or looking for certain scopes to be declared or something else, that those types of things can be flagged immediately and not missed, because we're moving so quickly to deliver so many APIs for our organization to support our mobile and web apps and partner integrations and so on. So it's really powerful.
Yeah. And I think, James, one of the other major challenges that I see today is a lot of enterprises are struggling with configuration management, because in a lot of the use cases, they're having certain configurations that are either misconfigured or missing. So in terms of in that use case, I see there may be a lot of use cases where, due to a misconfiguration, that might have created an API attack surface for malicious players to exploit. So in your experience, James, could you share a few use cases or studies that show how this particular misconfiguration has led to dire consequences?
Yeah, I'll touch on two now, and we'll probably have some more as we go. The first one was released to various news outlets back in January of 2023, and that was T-Mobile. Toward the end of 2022, they realized that they had personal data that was accessed via an API because it didn't have proper authorization settings configured on the gateway. So they had their gateway, they did what was right, licensed a gateway, put it in place, but they had either a missing or small configuration error that allowed people to use an API to get access to personal data. So the gateway was there, but it wasn't being told to enforce the proper authorization rules. Another one is Optus. Back in Q3 of last year, Optus also had a similar issue. They released details about a data breach of about 10 million customer accounts. So like T-Mobile, there was an error related to security configuration. They too had an API gateway, but when they deployed the API for this particular, to support this these few operations, they failed to configure that API to enforce authentication. So it became an open API. It was as if you could just freely, if you had an internet connection and you knew that endpoint, be able to talk to that and get data. There was no check whatsoever. And that's one of the situations that I often see. Either organizations don't have an API gateway at all because they think, well, this is a private API, it's internal, we're only using it from our mobile or web app, or only a select number of partners are using this, so we're not too concerned about it, so they don't put one in at all. Or they have one and they're sleeping well at night, but then they wake up the next day and somebody realizes, oh, we've had a breach of our API. Somebody's been making a bunch of API calls. And if you look at our logs, they've just been hammering our API with calls to ID 1, ID 2, ID 3. They're trying all kinds of different techniques to see how much data they can get. And the data they're getting is very private, precious, maybe even PII or MPI data that has resulted in leaks of data of their customers. And of course, that then creates all kinds of fear for the customers. They have to mitigate what happened. They have to release this. It can have a direct impact on their business just by simply failing to apply a configuration properly to an API that's behind an API gateway and trying to make sure that it's not misconfigured. So these misconfigurations are really one of the primary concerns that we have, because I think just about every CIO, CTO, anybody that's overseeing an API program, maybe a director or something, they know they need an API gateway, and they have one, or a lot of organizations have more than one API gateway, but they're not putting the right processes in place to check for that, and it's creating opportunities. And that's, to us, a really scary proposition, to be deploying APIs so quickly without sufficient automation that an API could get put behind an API gateway but not be properly configured, and thereby allow people to use that API to get access to sensitive data. So one of the things, sorry, one of the other things to consider is that, you know, a lot of what you just showed us can prevent that. So when you have linting rules that not only check for style guide consistency so that you have a great developer experience, but they also check for, do we have policies assigned in an open API specification? That's a really powerful way to do that. And you can do it at design time. You're not waiting to the last minute and then catching it right before it's supposed to go out into production. And somebody says, well, we'll do it next time because we got to get this thing out the door. We're under, you know, time constraints. We've made promises. We do it early, just like we would do anything else related to design and implementation considerations. We do it early. We shift that check left and make our security part of the design and delivery processes.
Oh, that's exactly right, James. In fact, in a lot of those stories, they don't end out too well, especially when it comes to the financial consequences. I do see, due to data breaches, the average cost can span anywhere from a couple of millions to even tens of millions of dollars. So, and this could certainly impact whether the API program continues or gets scrapped off due to budget constraints as well. So that's certainly one of the highest points of concerns, especially when it comes to these security principles over here. But what I'd also like to correlate with is, in a lot of the conversations, especially in the APAC region, where I see I do see a lot of the challenges, particularly using multiple APIs and API sprawl, and eventually having even a tool sprawl. But their concerns I see it's coming from the fact that when you use multiple diverse tools to manage different stages of the life cycle, I also do see that it's not possible for these different tools to sort of interoperate with one another because they were not designed or built to do that. So as soon as you take out the API assets outside the tool, immediately out goes your security, out goes your governance, out goes your compliance, everything goes out the window because those tools are not fundamentally built to interoperate with one another. So that's one of the other major challenges that I do see when it comes to API security and governance.
Yeah,
And
if I could just share a little anecdote as well, is that, when we, in our previous webinar, when we talked about linting, and you demonstrated how linting works with an APIwiz earlier, but when we talk about linting, there's a lot of time and resources required just to build linting rules. And then think about all the integration and the scripting that has to happen to make those tool chains come together. And I see that quite often is it's very hard to justify sometimes to to the office of the CFO or something of, we need a budget to be able to build this tool chain, and here's why. Sometimes that can get lost, or just in the day-to-day need to push things out quickly. Say, well, we need that team that we're going to have automate that tool chain over here working on something that's going to generate some revenue because we've got this partner program that we just ramped up and it's going to generate X number of million over the next couple of quarters or something, and this is going to be an amazing opportunity. We don't have time to do this tool chain automation. So and it's not easy. These tools do not work well together at all, just like you said. So it's either set aside or deferred, or it takes a large investment to be able to get to that point where you have that tool chain working the way you need it to work throughout the life cycle.
yeah, that's exactly right. In fact, James, just to hint back to our earlier point of view, you're talking about the design time governance and how we can automate these checks at the design phase. So in your view, James, do you think, how can we get started, or how do we get organizations to start adopting this shift left paradigm? And are there any barriers that they might want to hesitate in adopting this?
Yeah, I think the first thing that we need to think about is how can we automate these checks? One of the mistakes that I see a lot of organizations make is that they depend on manual checks. Some organizations may involve their cybersecurity teams to review everything, and oftentimes, just for the sake of speed, sometimes we even have executives decide to say, okay, well, you can just skip going there. We're just going to push this API out because maybe the API doesn't interact with PII, MPI data. We're not dealing with sensitive data, so we don't need to do that. And so a lot of the checks and policies that would be applied to it get ignored or skipped on purpose. So there's a lot of need to do checks for configuration and making sure things are properly set up, not only at design time, but also at runtime. So our API gateways protect our APIs only when they're configured properly. So we need a few different elements. One is we need that design time check like we've been talking about, looking for the policies declared in the Open API spec. And we saw in both of those case studies we talked about earlier and some of the anecdotes you've shared that oftentimes those security checks are either manual, done manually in a configuration, or they're running some sort of script that maybe someone forgot to run, and they're not automated as part of our CI/CD pipeline. So we automate all of our testing, and we have tests that verify that our code's working correctly and it's interoperating with the other services within our ecosystem, and that we haven't broken anything before we deploy, but we don't necessarily have any automation to do security checks. And so we can do that with linting at design time, and we can also do that at deployment time, making sure that the deployment of the security policies have been applied and checked and and are in good state. So there's some different things we can do that really help in that process and can really help close that gap and make sure that, one, we have proper security policies applied, and two, that it's done in an automated fashion, so at least there's a minimum base of API security policies applied at the gateway level to protect that API.
And even James, now that we have taken a couple of examples of the design time automation, probably one question I had for our audience as well is when it comes to usually in organizations, you have separate or distinct teams that are responsible for specifying the organizational standards or governance and security rules. So just in that particular use case, while they're defining or configuring the linting rule sets, so what are the top things that come to mind or should be validated when you're configuring the rule sets? It could be like something like an authorization header, or what are those top things that have to be considered when configuring your rule sets?
Yeah, we see a few different things applied. One is definitely like an authorization header. That way you can have automated checks that verify that that API is looking for the authorization header, so we can put it in the open API spec. We can automate or create tests that will be automatically applied to do that. I've seen the security property fields in the open API spec used as well to declare each operation, whether it uses an API key or an API token through, say, OAuth 2, and the particular scopes that are declared as well. And one of the things that I've seen is that we can have rules in the linter to check to see, is there at least one scope assigned to that operation? So a lot of times what we have is we have APIs that if they don't have a specific scope that's enforced, say like being able to read a particular account, read accounts or view accounts or maybe even something that's more administrative like update an account or something. When we have those kinds of policies, a lot of what we make sure we want to check for is that the open API specification has those declarations in place. That way, when we're designing, we're not just designing the machine-to-machine communications, the JSON, the HTTP paths, everything else. We're also designing security. We're thinking about security policy at the design phase. So those kinds of elements are really great to be able to put into a linter and have some basic rules. And then you can automate based on that. Whenever an API gets deployed, the deployment scripts or the deployment process can look at the specification and understand what policies need to be applied. And that allows us to then automate the configuration of the API gateway in the deployment phase. So you don't have to have hands-on manual configuration, manual policy creation that maybe because of time constraints, someone forgets a step, or we're training someone new and they missed a step or something. Everything is automated all the way through. So Open API Spec does have some specific provisions for that, which is great. The other thing that we've seen is the use of different extensions as well. So we can use Open API Spec extensions to declare other kinds of details as part of our automation process. So we might say, if we know that there are specific policies that we want to apply, we could put in an extension that references the specific policy. So rather than filling up that Open API Spec with all the different scopes and things, if we have some pre-configured policies or some specific rules that we need to have applied, we could reference them in the Open API Spec by adding an extension, a custom field in our Open API specification that defines all of those details. There was a worldwide hotel chain that I worked with a few years ago that used Open API Spec to automate their deployment process using the Open API Spec extensions. So they defined their security policies and the back-end Kubernetes services within specific namespaces that the gateway was to route the requests to. So not only did they have the routing rules, but they had the security rules, everything was there, and it allowed them at design time to declare all those details. And then as it went through the deployment process, it consistently got applied in the QA environments, and it got applied into the production environments. Likewise, we saw the Open API Spec extensions used in a bank in North America. They used those extensions and some code annotations to ensure that they had data entitlements implemented as well. So while we're talking a little bit more about security at the gateway, one of the other things that we oftentimes see is what would be considered row level or column level security, and lots of concerns around that in the banking industry. So they would define what roles or what permissions were allowed to see what fields, and either the fields that you weren't allowed to see were suppressed or they were tokenized, and made sure that they weren't exposed directly to that consumer unless they were allowed to see that. And even if they were tokenized, they would have to be dereferenced and made available so they could actually see the true values. And they used Open API spec extensions to do that, to apply security on multiple levels. So doing all of that, we do have to keep in mind that Open API spec only documents what the API security should be. So you do still have to take and apply that to your deployment automation. And that's really what excites me about APIwiz, is that we can take into account the automation across the entire API lifecycle and not just look at the design concerns that some tools and tool chains support, but we can look at the runtime concerns. We can make sure that we're applying the right policies all along the lifecycle, and that we're bringing this security further left into our design phase. So we're thinking about it early, not as a last minute decision that may have caused us to miss the mark. And there's a lot of concerns about that in regulated environments that Open API spec and some deployment automation, other lifecycle automation can help support.
That's right, James. In fact, you gave me the perfect cue to sort of shift into a short demo into how the build and deployment experience looks like on APIwiz. So what I'll do is I'll just quickly switch over to the platform again, and we'll see a short scenario of how we can build out and deploy a sample proxy or service on, let's say, one of the gateways like Apigee. And one of the really good things on APIwiz is, of course, the support for a federated gateway, which means that we support most of the major gateway providers out there, and we have connectors in place for all of them. And for the purpose of today's session, I've just taken Apigee as an example, but the concepts would apply to even the other gateways like Kong and Azure, and even all the other gateways that APIwiz supports. But just to hint back to your point, James, where you're talking about when it comes to enforcing security and governance, and in your build and deployment stage, you want to have a certain set of reusable artifacts that you can use across your deployments and build outs, and which is why we have something called as template-driven configurations on APIwiz, wherein we define these templates once, but reuse them across all your proxy and service deployments. So when it comes to Apigee as an example, we have all the proxy code that's generated in XML, as Apigee supports XML. So we have certain templates over here which can be used as a base to generate your proxy code that gets checked into your source control. By using these template-driven configurations, you can actually eliminate any sort of manual or erroneous due to human error that gets caused while pushing your proxy code onto your source control. And it's not just the proxy code, but even the policy management. For example, when you want to enforce a security and traffic management at the global level, let's say an operational admin comes in and says that no developer should be able to deploy any service which does not have a particular rate limiting or spike arrest in place. Or the same is true for even security policies like validating the OAuth token, for example. So as an operational admin, I can come and enable this. And let's say now as a developer, I'm logging on to the workspace and setting up a new proxy. And one of the other governance and checks that we've added when it comes to deploying these services is, you see that you can only work on the published Open API specs. So essentially, we are following the contract-driven lifecycle, which enforces the overall security and governance. So I'm not even allowed to select an API which is in draft or the review stage. So only the spec that has passed the correct set of linting is approved and published. I can use that in my deployments. And one of the other things that I do believe goes a long way, especially in terms of security and governance, is having data automation in place. So over here, you see that a lot of the field inputs are automatically populated by your approved contract that you're using during your deployment. Even when it comes to setting up your target endpoints, for example, which is specific to Apigee in this case, you'd see that a lot of the data is automatically populated for you. So there's not much of a manual intervention that's involved. So this helps to strengthen the overall security and governance posture of your API lifecycle. And one key thing to note here, earlier when I showed me as an operational admin enabling that policy, and now I'm coming in as a developer who's developing this particular service and pushing it to Apigee. So you see that I'm not able to uncheck this as a developer, which means that this has been enforced at a global level by an operational admin. So this particular use case can help eliminate a lot of those challenges and constraints that we saw earlier, especially in those two case studies that you highlighted, by saying that one of the authorization headers was missing or an authentication endpoint. No API will go unauthenticated into your production runtime. So all these steps and checks embedded across the lifecycle really help to enforce your overall API build and deployment stage as well. And it's not just the proxy deployment, right? When it comes to your API security and your security posture, it's also about the configs that work together with your APIs. For example, on APIwiz, for every single gateway, we have a config management that also follows a governance lifecycle of its own, meaning that every single config that you create across your gateways is going to follow a governance lifecycle. As soon as you create it, it's going to be created in review. And it's only the operational admins that can go ahead and approve this config that gets deployed onto your actual production runtime. If there are any changes or if the config has been rejected, it's not going to see the light of your production runtimes or even your gateway deployments. So that's one of the neat aspects and the security and governance controls that they're having in place on APIwiz that really helps to enhance not just your developer experience, but also patches a lot of those situations where you come into an ugly situation where an unauthenticated endpoint gets deployed onto your production runtime. So this really helps to strengthen your overall security posture.
Yeah, that is really powerful. And what you're showing is all of the automation that typically we have to have development teams get together. We have to stand up a small team. Typically, I see between 3 and 5 people on a team that are solely responsible for building out all of the tooling, integrating them together, getting everything built out, tying it into deployment pipelines, and still it doesn't allow the right policies to be applied necessarily unless it's checking for specific things. To be able to point and click and say, okay, I'm going to deploy to Apigee or whatever my API gateway is, and I can, as you showed, set default policies that can't be removed. That's huge. So not only do we not forget to apply a policy, but we can't circumvent some of it. We can't come in and say, you know what, just for the sake of time, we're going to remove this one policy, which has implications on the development that I have to do because of X, Y, and Z tasks that I have to conduct in the back end or something, as part of every request processing function. But all of that together combined make sure that we have a very clear stepwise approach from the design all the way through to deployment and into the runtime, that our security is configured properly and we're not going to be in the news, because the last thing we want to do is be in the news, whether it, for some kind of breach that we had to disclose because we failed to do something that should have been automated, should have been easy, should have been preventable. That's the last thing that we want. So that's quite powerful. So I see linting used a lot for API style guides, as I mentioned, naming conventions and things like that. But and every once in a while I'll see something where it looks for specific headers, application IDs, authorization IDs, other types of things that different organizations implement. But I never see it into the deployment phase. That's usually design, and then there's something else that happens. I do have one client that I have been working with for several years, and they have a lot of automation in place, but they have a dedicated team. They have a dedicated team for their own design tool. There's about 5-6 people at least on that one, and they have another at least 5 to 6 people where they've built out all the deployment, and they're dedicated. You can't take those 10 to 12 people and put them on anything else, because if you do, you risk losing all of the support that's needed for this infrastructure. And here we just have it, and it's done. So once you configure it, then it's ready to go, and that's going to save loads of time and reduce the risk for our attack surface through our APIs. So that's great.
Yeah. Thanks, James. I see we're almost at the top of the hour, so I'd like to thank you, James, for taking time and joining our session today. It was really informative, and also thank you so much for the audience for joining in and being a part of today's webinar on shift left API security. And of course, we'd love to hear all your feedback, suggestions, and comments. And you could do that by sending an email to us at info@apiwiz.com. And some of the interesting updates that we also have from the webinar perspective is some of the upcoming webinars we're going to have on API portfolio management, assessing your program maturity models, and also somewhere later on towards the year, we're also going to talk about API compliance as well. So stay tuned for those updates from APIwiz. And of course, do follow James and me on LinkedIn, as well as the official APIwiz LinkedIn handle. For all the latest news, actions, and updates from APIwiz. Once again, thanks you all for joining, and until next time, cheers. Have a nice day.